This is not music. This is chaos. This is a disgrace to everything this show represents. Ed Sullivan's voice was ice cold with fury as he stood backstage at CBS Studio 50 watching the young man at piano through the monitor. It was May 1956, and 23-year-old Jerry Lee Lewis was rehearsing for his first appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, and Ed Sullivan was watching his worst nightmare unfold in real time. Jerry Lee wasn't just playing the piano. He was pounding the keys with violent intensity, kicking the piano bench side, standing up, jumping, his hair flying wild, his whole body consumed by the music. This wasn't the refined entertainment Ed Sullivan built his show around. This was something primal, dangerous, completely out of control. Ed turned to his producer with an expression of absolute disgust. Get him off that date now. What happened in the next 24 hours would create one of the most controversial moments in television history and set in motion a tragedy that would destroy Jerry Lee Lewis's career just 2 years later. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to witness is the moment when rock and roll's wildest performer faced television's strictest authority, and neither one would back down. To understand why Ed Sullivan was so horrified by Jerry Lee Lewis, you need to understand what Ed represented to 1950s America. Ed Sullivan wasn't just a TV host, he was the guardian of American TV. The Ed Sullivan Show was the most powerful platform in entertainment, and Ed took that responsibility seriously. For 8 years, Ed had presented wholesome family entertainment to America every Sunday night. He was methodical, conservative, and deeply protective of his show's reputation. When rock and roll started gaining popularity, Ed had been reluctant to embrace. Even booking Elvis had been a calculated business decision that he'd regretted personally. But Jerry Lee Lewis represented everything Ed feared about rock and roll take to extreme. Jerry Lee had grown up in Florida, Louisiana, in extreme poverty. His family were deeply religious Pentecostal Christians who believed secular music was the devil's work. But Jerry Lee had been born with an extraordinary gift. He could play piano like nobody else. Not classical piano, but wild, pounding, rhythmic piano that seemed to come from some deep, untamed place. As a teenager, Jerry Lee struggled with the conflict between his religious upbringing and his love of music. The church said rock and roll was sinful, but Jerry Lee couldn't stop playing. The music was in his blood, in his soul. It wasn't a choice, it was who he was. By 1956, Jerry Lee was performing in small clubs across the South, building a reputation as the wildest performer anyone had ever seen. He didn't just play piano. He assaulted, stood on, kicked it, even set it on fire once. His performances were pure chaos, pure energy, pure rebellion against every rule about how music was supposed to be performed. Elvis Presley had shocked America with his hit move, but Jerry Lee Lewis made Elvis look tame. When Sam Phillips at Sun Records heard Jerry Lee perform, he immediately recognized something special and terrifying. This kid is either going to be the biggest star in the world or burn out spectacular, Phillips told his staff. There's no middle ground. In early 1956, Jerry Lee recorded Whole Lotta Shakin' Going On. The song was raw, sexual, dangerous. Radio stations were afraid to play it, but the few that did got an overwhelming response. Young people loved it. It was everything their parents hated, which made it perfect. As the song started climbing the chart, Ed Sullivan's talent coordinators heard. They knew Ed would hate it, but they also knew that after the massive success of booking Elvis, they needed to stay ahead of the rock and roll curve. They approached Ed about booking Jerry Lee Lewis. Ed's initial response was an absolute no. Have you heard his music? Ed asked his coordinators. It's vulgar. It's crude. It's exactly the kind of degeneracy I will not promote on my show. But his coordinators pressed hard. Mr. Sullivan, he's going to be huge. If we don't book him, Steve Allen will, and we'll lose the youth audience again. Ed reluctantly agreed to watch footage of Jerry Lee perform. What he saw confirmed every fear. Jerry Lee Lewis was everything Ed Sullivan despised about rock and roll multiplied by 10. But the audience response in the footage was undeniable. Young people were going absolutely crazy for him. Ed made a decision that he would later regret. He would book Jerry Lee Lewis, but with strict conditions. The performance would be controlled, supervised, civilized. Jerry Lee would sit at the piano like a proper musician. He would play his song, and that would be it. No wildness, no chaos, no jumping on the piano. Ed coordinators contacted Jerry Lee's manager and extended the invitation with clear conditions. Jerry Lee was thrilled when he got the news. The Ed Sullivan Show was the biggest platform in America, but when he heard about Ed's condition, he laughed. They want me to sit still. They want me to be proper. That ain't me. That ain't what people pay to see. His manager was more cautious. Jerry, this is the Ed Sullivan Show. You can't mess this up. Just do what they ask. One show their way, then you can do whatever you want. But Jerry Lee wasn't convinced. The night before the show, Jerry Lee was pacing in his hotel room, anxious. He'd been thinking about Ed Sullivan's conditions all day. What if I can't do it? Jerry Lee said to his young wife Myra. What if I get up there and I just freeze because I'm trying to be something I'm not? Myra, who understood Jerry Lee better than anyone, said something that would change everything. Then don't do it. Be yourself, Jerry. That's why people love. Don't let them change. Jerry Jerry Lee looked at his wife and realized she was right. The reason he was getting this opportunity in the first place was because of who he was, not who Ed Sullivan wanted to be. The next day, May 12, 1956, Jerry Lee arrived at CBS Studios for rehearsal. Ed Sullivan watched from the control room as Jerry Lee took his position at the piano for the sound check. And that's when Jerry Lee did exactly what he always did. He exploded. His hands were a blur on the key. His leg came up and kicked the piano. He stood up, shouted, pounded the keys with his fist. The studio crew stopped what they were doing, stunned by the raw energy. Ed Sullivan came down from the control room, his face dark with anger. He walked onto the stage, and his presence immediately changed the atmosphere. Stop, Ed commanded. Jerry Lee stopped playing mid-song. He turned to face Ed, knowing what was coming. Young lad, Ed began, his voice tight with controlled fury. What exactly do you think you're doing? Jerry Lee met Ed's eye. I'm playing my song, sir. That, Ed said, is not playing. That is chaos. That is a circus act. Tomorrow night, 70 million Americans will be watching this program. Family, children, people who trust me to bring quality entertainment into their home. What you just did is not quality entertainment. It's a degradation of music itself. Jerry Lee felt anger rise. With respect, Mr. Sullivan, that's how I perform. That's what people want to see. I don't care what people want to see. Ed shot back. I care about what's appropriate for American television, and what you just did is not appropriate. Ed stepped closer to Jerry Lee, his voice dropping to a cold, hard tone. Tomorrow night, you will sit at that piano like a gentleman. You will play your song properly. No kicking, no jumping, no vulgar display. You will behave like a professional musician, or you will never work on television again. Do you understand me? The studio was completely silent. Everyone was watching this confrontation between the old guard and the new. Jerry Lee was supposed to say yes, sir, supposed to agree, supposed to comply. Instead, he said something that shocked everyone in the room. Mr. Sullivan, I appreciate the opportunity, but I can't promise I'll play it your way. This is who I am. This is my music. If that's not good enough for your show, then maybe I shouldn't be here. Ed Sullivan's face turned red. Nobody challenged him like this. Nobody in his entire career had ever stood on his stage and told no. You're making a serious mistake, young man. Ed said quietly, I'm giving you a chance to be on the biggest show in America, and you're throwing it away because you can't control yourself for 3 minutes. It's not about control, Jerry Lee replied. It's about being on. If I get up there tomorrow and pretend to be something I'm not, I'm lying to the audience. I'm lying to myself, and I can't do that. Ed stared at Jerry Lee for a long moment. Then he turned to his producers. We'll see tomorrow night whether he can control himself. If he can't, we'll cut to commercial, and he'll never appear on this show again. That night, back at the hotel, Jerry Lee was terrified, but he was also resolved. I can't be anything but myself, he told Myra. If I start pretending, if I start playing it safe, I'll lose what makes me different. May 13, 1956. The Ed Sullivan Show went live at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Families across America settled in front of their television set, expecting the usual wholesome entertainment. Ed did his opening monologue, introduced the first guests. The evening was proceeding normally. Then it was time for Jerry Lee Lewis. Ed's introduction was notably cool. Our next performer is a young man who's had some success with his recording of Whole Lotta Shakin' Going On. Jerry Lee Lewis. No enthusiasm, no build-up, just a name. Jerry Lee walked onto the stage, and America got its first look at young slick-back blonde hair, wearing a dark suit that looked slightly too small. He sat down at the piano. The studio audience waited. Ed Sullivan waited. 70 million Americans waited. And Jerry Lee made his decision. He wasn't going to play it Ed's way. He was going to play it his way. His hands hit the keys, and Whole Lotta Shakin' Going On exploded across American living rooms. Within seconds, Jerry Lee was standing. His leg came up and kicked the piano. He pounded the keys with both hands and feet. He threw his head back and shouted. The studio audience erupted. Teenage girls screaming. Parents watching at home horrified. In the control room, the director looked at Ed Sullivan, waiting for the signal cut to commercial. But Ed just stood there, frozen, watching his worst nightmare unfold on live television. He could cut away. He could end this. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the audience reaction. Maybe it was the knowledge that cutting away would be an admission that he couldn't control his own show. Or maybe on some level, even Ed Sullivan recognized that he was watching something historic, something that couldn't be stopped. Jerry Lee played for 3.5 minutes, every second more intense than the last. When he hit the final chord, the studio audience was on its feet screaming. The reaction was unlike anything Ed Sullivan had ever seen on his show. Jerry Lee stood up from the piano, breathing hard, sweat pouring down his face. He looked directly at the camera, then at Ed Sullivan in the wings. The message was clear. I did it my way. Ed walked onto the stage. As they went to commercial, his face face was unreadable. Jerry Lee expected to be thrown out, banned from television forever. Instead, Ed did something unexpected. That was quite a performance, Ed said stiffly. The audience is certainly enthusiastic. Jerry Lee nodded, too exhausted to speak. Then Ed said something that surprised everyone. You're very talented, young man, but talent without discipline is dangerous. Remember that. Then Ed walked away, leaving Jerry Lee standing there, unsure if he'd just been complimented or warned. The reaction to Jerry Lee's performance was immediate and divided. NBC and CBS switchboards were flooded with calls. Half were outraged parents, demanding that this vulgar performer never be allowed on television again. Half were teenagers begging to know when Jerry Lee would be back. Ed Sullivan's office received hundreds of letters, some condemning him for exposing American families to this degeneracy, others thanking him for bringing exciting new music television. Ed himself was conflicted. He'd been defied on his own show, his authority challenged, but the ratings for that episode were huge. The youth audience had tuned in record number, and despite his personal distaste, Ed recognized that Jerry Lee Lewis was a phenomenon. In the weeks after the show, Ed made a decision that surprised his staff. He invited Jerry Lee back, not immediately, but a few months later. The thinking was that if Jerry Lee was going to be on television anyway, which he certainly would be after that performance, it should be on the Ed Sullivan Show, where Ed could maintain some control. Jerry Lee appeared on Ed's show 2 more times in 1956 and 1957. Each time Ed attempted to impose restrictions. Each time Jerry Lee ignored them and performed with the same wild energy. And each time the ratings were enormous. Ed and Jerry Lee developed a strange relationship. Not friendship, but grudging acknowledgement. Ed recognized Jerry Lee's talent and popularity. Jerry Lee acknowledged that Ed had given him a massive platform, even if Ed hated his performance style. But then in 1958, disaster struck. A reporter discovered Jerry Lee's marriage to his 13-year-old second cousin Myra. The scandal was immediate and devastating. The British press went insane. Radio stations pulled his records. Venues canceled bookings. His career crashed overnight. Ed Sullivan's office immediately issued a statement. Jerry Lee Lewis will never appear on the Ed Sullivan Show again. The scandal was too much, even for ratings. Looking back at Ed Sullivan's relationship with Jerry Lee Lewis, a complicated picture emerges. Ed was right that Jerry Lee needed discipline, that his wild behavior was dangerous. But Ed was wrong to try to suppress Jerry Lee's authentic artistic expression. The tragedy is that Ed's worst fears about Jerry Lee came true, but not because of his music. Jerry Lee's downfall came from his personal life, from a moral failure that had nothing to do with how he played piano. Ed Sullivan died in 1974, long before Jerry Lee's career rehabilitation. People who knew Ed said he felt vindicated by the Myra scandal. He'd warned that Jerry Lee was dangerous, and Jerry Lee's catastrophic judgment seemed to prove Ed right. The story of Ed Sullivan and Jerry Lee Lewis is complicated because both men were partially right and partially wrong. Ed was right about discipline, but wrong to suppress artistic expression. Jerry Lee was right to be authentic, but wrong about personal choices. The lesson isn't simple. It's not be yourself no matter what, because being yourself included making catastrophic choices. It's not always listen to authority, because Ed's concerns about Jerry Lee's music were misguided. The real lesson might be that artistic freedom and personal responsibility are both important. Jerry Lee was right to defend his artistic integrity, but wrong to lack integrity in his personal life. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and share it with someone who appreciates complicated stories about talent and consequence. Sometimes the warnings we receive are right, even if they're focused on the wrong thing.